December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. 18 American soldiers, 500 German paratroopers, 18 hours, no tanks, no artillery, no reinforcements. What happened on this frozen ridge would delay Hitler's last offensive by an entire day and be forgotten for 37 years. The sound of the engine was wrong, too heavy for a truck, too loud for a jeep. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck pressed his chest against the frozen ground and listened. He was 20 years old. He commanded an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Regiment, 99th Infantry Division. 18 men, most of them barely out of high school. Their job was simple: watch the road, report, not fight. But the radio was dead, and through the frozen mist, shapes were materializing. A Volkswagen amphibious car, then a half-track, then infantry, hundreds of them. The Ardennes forest was supposed to be quiet. The Americans called it the Ghost Front. For weeks, nothing had happened here. Green troops were sent to rest. Veterans were rotated out. The generals believed the Germans were finished. They were wrong. On the morning of December 16th, Hitler launched his last gamble. 250,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, a massive thrust through the Ardennes, aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the port of Antwerp. The plan depended on one thing: speed. The 6th Panzer Army had to cross the Meuse River within 48 hours. Every minute mattered. Every delay was a disaster. And the spearhead of the entire offensive, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most ruthless armored unit in the German military, was aimed directly at the road below Lanzerath Ridge. The road Bouck's 18 men were watching, the road that was supposed to be undefended. Bouck had dug his men into a slight elevation overlooking the village. Shallow foxholes, log-covered dugouts, a fence line for concealment. They had 4.30 caliber machine guns, a handful of Browning automatic rifles, M1 Garands with maybe 100 rounds per man, 1.50 caliber machine gun mounted on a jeep hidden in the trees. What they didn't have was artillery support, or anti-tank weapons, or any idea that the unit marching toward them wasn't just a patrol. It was the 1st Battalion, 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite German paratroopers, 500 men, marching 4 abreast, weapons slung over their shoulders. They were laughing. They believed the artillery had killed everything in front of them. They were about to find out otherwise. It had started at 0530. The horizon turned orange. For 90 minutes. German artillery shook the forest. Trees shattered. The earth heaved. Snow vaporized into steam. Bouck's men pressed themselves into their holes and prayed. When the shelling stopped, the silence was worse. Bouck grabbed the field telephone. Dead. He tried the radio. Static. He looked at the men around him. Scared. Cold. Waiting. Then, through the mist, the column appeared. Bouck watched through his binoculars. The Germans moved with arrogance. No scouts ahead. No flanking security. They assumed the road was clear. Bouck whispered the order down the line. Wait. The column moved closer. 200 yards. Wait. 100 yards. The lead German officer stopped. He lit a cigarette. 75 yards. Then, a girl from the village ran out of a house. She was shouting, pointing at the ridge, warning them. The element of surprise was gone. Bouck didn't hesitate. Fire. The .50 caliber didn't fire. It roared. The burst cut through the front rank of the German column like a scythe. The 4.30 caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously. Bars chattered. M1 Garands cracked and pinged. The road became a slaughterhouse. German paratroopers dove into ditches, scrambled behind embankments, screamed for medics. They had no idea where the fire was coming from. The muzzle flashes were hidden in the dense fir trees. For 10 chaotic minutes, the Americans poured fire into the valley. The Germans fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead on the gray asphalt. The first assault had failed. It was 0800 hours. The 18 men looked at each other. They had just gutted an elite German battalion. But this wasn't over. Bouck sent a runner toward the regimental command post. The message was simple. Engaged by enemy force. Request artillery. Request orders. The runner returned an hour later. His face was pale. "They're gone, Lieutenant." "What do you mean, gone?" "The 14th Cavalry on our left pulled out. The unit on our right is gone. There's nobody." Bouck looked at his men. They were alone, completely alone. The entire northern shoulder of the American line had collapsed around them, and nobody had told them. There would be no artillery, no reinforcements, no rescue. They were the line now. The whistle blew in the valley. The Germans weren't marching this time. They were running. They came up the slope, using every depression, every fold in the ground for cover. Mortar shells began to walk up the hill. The first one hit 20 yards short. The second hit the tree line. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Bouck moved from foxhole to foxhole, distributing ammunition, shouting over the explosions. Short bursts make every round count. Private Sakanikas, manning a .30 caliber, kept the barrel hot. Controlled bursts, traversing fire. The Germans reached the barbed wire fence, halfway up the slope. Grenades arced through the air. The snow turned black with powder burns. But the crossfire was murderous. The Germans thought they were facing a company, maybe a battalion. They couldn't believe 18 men were producing this volume of fire. The second assault faltered. They fell back again. Bouck counted his ammunition. They were burning through it too fast. The light was fading. The gray winter sky pressed down on the ridge. Temperature, 20 degrees and dropping. Fingers were going numb. Rifle bolts were freezing shut. Down in the village, the German commanders were furious. This ridge was supposed to be clear by 0800. The entire Ardennes timetable, Hitler's last gamble, was bleeding away. At 1400 hours, they stopped trying to be careful. They threw everything at the ridge. Flanking maneuvers through the woods. Mortar fire from 3 directions. Machine gun suppression from the village. Private Milosevic was hit in the face by shrapnel. Blood poured down his cheek. "I can still see them, Lieutenant. I can still shoot." Private MacDonald spotted movement in the trees to their left. He swung his BAR and fired. The tracers set the dry brush on fire. Screams echoed through the smoke. Clips were thrown between foxholes. Last belt. Men were scavenging ammunition from the bottom of their holes, wiping off mud, jamming clips into rifles. The fighting became a brawl. An hour of continuous fire. The radio crackled to life. Bouck grabbed the handset, desperate. A voice from Division HQ, scratchy, broken. "Withdraw. Repeat. Withdraw." Bouck looked behind them. German machine guns now covered the road. Withdrawal meant running across open ground into interlocking fire. Withdrawal was suicide. "We can't." The radio died. The sun was going down. Darkness should have been their cover. Instead, it became their coffin. The Germans stopped trying to be tactical. They simply flooded the ridge. A white flare shot up from the village, the signal. They came screaming through the trees, firing from the hip, hundreds of them. The American machine guns chattered, cutting lanes through the assault. But there were too many. Private Sakanikas took a burst of MP-40 fire to the face. He fell back into the frozen mud, blood pooling around his head. One by one, the guns clicked empty. Bouck pulled the trigger on his carbine. Nothing. He drew his pistol. The Germans were on top of the foxholes now, bayonets against entrenching tools. The fighting was hand-to-hand, screaming, grunting, the wet sound of steel on flesh. Bouck found himself in the bottom of his foxhole, empty pistol in one hand, his last grenade in the other. He could hear German boots crunching in the snow, 10 yards away, 5. He looked at his men, bleeding, freezing, empty weapons. 20-year-old faces, faces of boys who trusted him. He pulled the pin. He could throw it, take a few more with him, end it right here. His thumb held the spoon down. The seconds stretched. Then he looked at those faces one more time. He put the pin back in. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Shadows swarmed over the foxholes. Submachine guns pointed at their heads. A German officer jumped into Bouck's position, flashlight blinding, weapon leveled. He looked around the ridge. He looked at the empty foxholes. His voice was incredulous. "Where are the others?" Bouck stood up slowly, hands raised. "What others?" "The rest of your regiment. Where are they?" Bouck shook his head. "There is no regiment. This is it." The German lowered his flashlight. He looked at the 18 exhausted, bleeding Americans. Then he looked down the slope, at the carnage. The bodies of his own men, scattered across the snow. Dozens of them, maybe 100. 18? Bouck met his eyes. 18. The prisoners were marched down the hill into the village. 55 wounded Germans lay in the aid station. The streets were clogged with stalled vehicles. As the Americans were lined up against a wall, an engine roared. A massive King Tiger tank turned the corner. The hatch opened. Standartenführer Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the entire German offensive, climbed out. He was supposed to be at the Meuse River by now. Instead, he was still here. 18 hours behind schedule. He looked at the paratroop commander. He looked at the 18 American prisoners. His face twisted with rage. He screamed at the German officers, demanded explanations, threatened courts-martial. He never even glanced at the Americans. They weren't worth his attention. But they had already taken what mattered most: his time. The final count for the I&R Platoon: 18 men engaged, 16 wounded, 1 killed later in captivity. German casualties: estimates range from 92 confirmed to over 400 killed and wounded. The 1st Battalion, 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, was combat ineffective. But the real cost wasn't measured in bodies, it was measured in hours. 18 hours. Because of Lanzerath Ridge, Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the critical bridges too late. American combat engineers had already blown them. The fuel depots that could have sustained the German advance for weeks were captured by the Americans instead. The armored column that was supposed to split the Allied armies spent precious gasoline idling on a frozen road, waiting for 18 men to run out of bullets. While Bouck and his men were being loaded onto trucks for the POW camps, the 99th Division was digging in at Elsenborn Ridge. We covered the defense of Bastogne before, the 101st Airborne's heroism. But without the time bought at Lanzerath, Bastogne might have been overrun before the paratroopers arrived. The delay broke the rhythm of the German advance, and they never got it back. The prisoners were marched east into Germany. They spent the rest of the war in POW camps. Frostbite, starvation, dysentery, Sakanikas shot in the face. Survived his wounds. They all survived, together. When the war ended, they went home. Bouck became a chiropractor. Others went back to farms, factories, offices. They didn't talk about Lanzerath. They thought they had failed. They had been captured. In their minds, that meant defeat. And the army didn't correct them. The records were buried. The reports were lost. The chaos of the Bulge swallowed their story whole. Historians wrote about Patton's tanks, about Bastogne, about McAuliffe's. Nuts. Nobody wrote about the 18 men who made all of it possible. For 37 years, some of them were even labeled as cowards in the missing unit report. Men who had held a ridge for 18 hours against 500 were marked as having abandoned their position. In 1981, a military historian named John Eisenhower, son of the general, was reviewing records of the Bulge. He found the file on Lanzerath. He couldn't believe what he was reading. He pushed the case to the Pentagon. The review took months. When it was finished, the conclusion was unanimous. The action at Lanzerath Ridge was one of the most extraordinary small unit engagements in American military history. In a ceremony in Washington, the entire platoon was finally decorated. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck received the Distinguished Service Cross. So did 3 others. Every single man in the unit received a medal for valor. It became the most decorated platoon action of World War II. 37 years late. For 37 years, nobody told their story. Now you know it. After the capture, as the Americans were being marched away into the darkness, the German officer who had taken the ridge asked Bouck one final question. "Why did you keep fighting?" Bouck didn't have a speech ready. He didn't quote regulations, or duty, or country. He looked at the men beside him, the same faces he'd seen in the foxholes, bleeding, frozen, exhausted, alive. Because we were here. The sun set over Lanzerath Ridge. The village was burning. The tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Division finally began to roll past the empty foxholes. Their engines roared in the cold December night, but the roads ahead were already blocked. The bridges were already blown. The timeline had fractured, and 15 miles to the west, the German advance had stopped, because 18 men refused to. The foxholes are still there today, shallow depressions in the Belgian earth, slowly filling with leaves and time. If you stand on that ridge, you can see the road below, the road to the Meuse, the road that stayed closed just long enough. If your grandfather fought in the Ardennes, if your family has stories from that winter, they belong here too. Some of you are watching from the places we describe. History isn't just in the archives. It's in the comments. It's in the families who remember. The records were lost for decades. The courage was not. But the SS unit that finally broke through at Lanzerath, Kampfgruppe Peiper, was heading toward a crossroads called Malmedy, and they weren't taking prisoners anymore. That story is next.